Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Peter Martinez, and I'm the Executive Director of Secure World Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Secure World Foundation webinar on space security, where we will discuss recent developments in multilateral space security discussions and explore what the future might hold. Those among us who've been involved in space diplomacy for some time will know how difficult it has been to make progress on the difficult issue of space security. In part, this has had to do with the fundamentally different approaches to tackling the issue, which in my mind has created a sort of false dichotomy of legally binding versus non-binding approaches that has divided the actors into different camps, each with their strongly held views on the right way to ensure space security and to prevent outer space becoming a domain of conflict. At the same time, the pace of developments in the global space arena, especially driven by the rapid growth of the commercial space sector in recent years, has heightened the sense of urgency to adopt some effective governance measures to ensure the safety, security, and sustainability of space operations. In recent years, we've seen a growing acceptance that a behavioral, norms-based approach offers the possibility to bridge the dichotomy between voluntary and legally binding approaches by creating fertile ground for developing common understandings of what constitutes responsible behaviors and for promoting commonly agreed practices of states that could ultimately pave the way for the adoption of legally binding instruments. One of the behaviors that has attracted considerable attention in the past couple of years as being legal but undesirable, or as some would say, lawful but awful, is the conduct of direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests, which produce copious amounts of debris in space. Last December, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 77/41, calling upon states to commit not to conduct such tests. This resolution was passed by a large majority of 155 states, with only 9 abstentions and 9 votes against. Since the adoption of that resolution, 37 states have made this commitment. In today's event, we will discuss recent developments around these topics that I've just mentioned. This is a 3-part event. In the first part, we will discuss the recently concluded UN Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats. In the second part, we will review the progress made since the adoption of UN General Assembly Resolution 77/41 and examine the reasons why countries choose to support or oppose this ASAT test ban moratorium. Lastly, we will end the event with the launch of some new Secure World Foundation products that track these multilateral space security initiatives. Those of you who know Secure World Foundation will know that we've been active participants in various space security processes and dialogues for over a decade. For a long time, discussions in multilateral fora were essentially deadlocked, but over the past few years, we've seen a number of promising new developments. There are now new approaches to discussing the problem, and there are now also many more countries actively engaging in space security dialogues. For this reason, we at Secure World have decided to establish a new high-level portfolio on space security and stability. And today I'm happy to announce that this new portfolio will be led by Victoria Sampson, who has been with the Foundation since inception and has over 25 years of experience in military space and security issues. Before diving into the program, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Secure World team for putting together this event and our expert speakers who are participating today. Thank you also to you, the audience, for joining us. We look forward to your engagement in the discussions. It's now my pleasure to call upon Victoria to open and moderate our first panel. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson with the Secure World Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here to speak with a fantastic panel about the recent UN Open-Ended Working Group on Space Threats. Love seeing all the hellos in the comments. It's great to see so many friends in the audience, and looking forward to having a really good conversation with everyone. I will point out that if you need closed captioning, a link has been posted in the chat to our YouTube channel. And as well, we will be taking questions from the audience through our comment section here on the streaming platform of StreamYard. So with that, again, we're going to be having a quick panel recapping the UN Open Working Group on Reducing Space Threats. I will point out that it met over the past 2 years. It met 4 times, meeting from May 2022 to August of this year. And it had widespread participation from more than 70 countries. Secure World Foundation was able to participate as a civil society observer thanks to the decision of Helmut Lagos, the working group chair, to be as inclusive as possible. And I think we'll go into some detail on this, but while the group was unable to reach consensus in the final report, I would argue this open-ended working group was a success. It socialized the idea of focusing on behavior as an approach for these space security diplomatic options. It brought many more countries into the discussion and popularized the role of non-legally binding instruments as one tool in an overall toolkit that can bulwark space security. And for many countries, it demonstrated the value of participating in these discussions and putting legitimate proposals on the table. So with that, I would love to introduce our panelists going in alphabetical order. We have Almudena Azcarate Ortega, who is a space security researcher at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or UNIDIR. She has published widely and briefed UN member states on topics of space security law and policy, and has presented her research in multiple fora. She has led UNIDIR's participation in the UN Open-Ended Working Group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, established pursuant to the UN General Assembly Resolution 76/231. Prior to joining UNIDIR, Almudena was a research assistant at Georgetown University Law Center, where she is currently a doctoral candidate. She holds an LLM in national security law from the same institution. She received her LLB from the University of Navarra, Spain. Claudio Leopoldino is in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. Claudio has been a career diplomat at the Brazilian Foreign Service since 2003. He is the former Deputy Coordinator General for Defense Affairs at the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2013 to 2015. He has also served at the delegation of Brazil in the United Nations, the IAEA, Guatemala, and Haiti. Claudio is currently serving as the head of Disarmament and Sensitive Technologies Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He holds BA and MA degrees in International Relations from the University of Brasilia. And last, we have Dr. Jessica West, who leads research to advance peace and security in outer space through a humanitarian focus on space for all and benefits to people on the planet. As part of this work, she interacts regularly with key United Nations bodies tasked with space security and space safety issues. Related research interests include approaches to peace and disarmament rooted in humanitarian protection and feminist perspectives, as well as the impact of new technologies on space security, such as cyber connectivity and artificial intelligence. Jessica holds a PhD in global governance from the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She currently holds roles as a research fellow at the Kindred Credit Union Center for Peace Advancement and as a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI. So with that, I'd like to start off with just a few brief opening remarks from each panelist. Almudena, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Secure World for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all and to be sharing this panel with such wonderful co-panelists. Since I am the one to start today, I'd like to provide some context into the OEWG and how it came to be. So as Peter already said in his opening remarks, we've been talking about space security for a very long time. This is not a new topic, and despite the fact that UN member states have been trying to come up with mechanisms to address space security concerns for many, many years, they've done so with limited success. And the reason for this, I would say, is twofold. On the one hand, there is a disagreement on what to ban, and the Outer Space Treaty, for example, bans the stationing, installation, or placement of weapons of mass destruction in space, but it doesn't really say anything about conventional weapon. And also, states have struggled to determine whether or not defining what a space weapon is. So this inability to agree on what capabilities to ban has been a problem. We've been shifting towards, as Victoria and Peter already mentioned, to a behavioral approach which I think combined with this traditional arms control approach that focuses more on capabilities, could be a good recipe for success in the future. Looking at capabilities is important, but looking at how those capabilities are used, how states behave when they employ those capabilities is important as well. So this is a new development that conversations surrounding the open-ended working group brought. Then there is a disagreement on how to ban or how to mitigate space security threats. And as Peter mentioned, this is kind of a false dichotomy. And when I say we, I don't mean me, I mean the states. They have traditionally seen the legally binding approach and the non-legally binding approach as incompatible. But the reality is that, and Peter already mentioned this, is that this is false. They are actually really closely interrelated and highly complementary and mutually reinforcing. And again, I believe that discussions throughout the work of the OEWG have served to highlight this. We've had states from across the whole geopolitical spectrum saying that these different mechanisms can support one another and they can be negotiated at the same time without having to be seen as mutually exclusive or incompatible. And I believe that the clearest evidence that we see of this is the Outer Space Treaty itself. We have to remember that the Outer Space Treaty came to be in great part due to the fact that right before it was negotiated and enacted, 2 UN General Assembly resolutions were negotiated by member states. And those 2 UN General Assembly resolutions essentially contained the principles that eventually were to become the what we know today as the Outer Space Treaty. So moving on to the OEWG itself. The mandate of the OEWG had 4 masses for states to and other stakeholders to address. Firstly, it was to take stock of existing international legal and other normative frameworks concerning threats arising from state behaviours with respect to space. That was addressed in the first session. In the second session, the group considered current and future threats by states to space systems and actions, activities, and omissions that could be considered irresponsible. Then during the third session, the group started to talk about recommendations and possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours relating to threats by states to space systems, including, as appropriate, how they would contribute to the negotiation of a legally binding instrument, including on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And during the fourth session, these negotiations were continued, and the group tried to draft a report and agree on our reports that eventually would be presented to the General Assembly. Unfortunately, the group was unable to reach the necessary consensus to agree on this report and eventually be able to present it to the General Assembly, as was the mandate. But I don't think that the failure to reach this report was a failure of the work of the group, as Victoria mentioned. I think the discussions that were had in the group were actually highly successful. I think the mandate itself of this OEWG already showcases a step forward in the way that states have been thinking about space security, because it really includes these 2 approaches that Peter called a false dichotomy of incompatibility. The legally binding approach and the non-legally binding approach are contained together in this mandate, therefore being shown as very much compatible. Even though we didn't have a report, I do want to highlight that the chair published a summary under his own authority and responsibility, and this summary is available in the OEWG's website, and I would encourage everyone who's interested to check it out. It provided several recommendations, which were to be the recommendations of the group if the group had reached the necessary consensus. But even if it's not an official report of the group, I think these recommendations do provide a useful basis for future negotiations on space security. There were 9 recommendations in total, and they can be further grouped into three groups or categories. So the first group focuses on avoiding the weaponization of outer space. So these are recommendations on avoiding the damage or the destruction of space objects, or the use of space objects as weapons, through kinetic means, like, for example, the tests that were mentioned at the beginning of this seminar, that cause space debris, but count space capabilities. And essentially any type of activity that can cause an interference with the normal and safe operation of space objects. The second group or cluster of recommendations was focused on protecting outer space through the compliance with existing legal obligations. I think that one trap that states tend to fall into when they sit down to negotiate new mechanisms or new measures for space security is that they try to reinvent the wheel. And during the conversations at the OEWG and in this chair summary as well, we are all reminded that this is not necessary, that we already have a robust body of international law that we can rely on when attempting to negotiate new measures. And it's important that we take advantage of that, because reaching common understanding based on already agreed principles is much easier than reaching common understanding from scratch. And then last but not least, the last block, the third block of recommendations was focused on transparency. This again is not a new idea. We had a GD in 2013 and also another GD in 1993, which heavily focused on transparency and competence building measures. And these recommendations in the chair summary kind of echo the sentiments of those reports from those GDs. These recommendations focus on sharing military space policies, doctrines, and strategies, notifying certain activities in space, like maneuvers between orbits, close approaches, etc., and also notifications of defense and security exercises. So again, to conclude this initial intervention, I'd like to say that, as Victoria mentioned, even though this group didn't end up agreeing on a consensus report, this is not a failure. I think the work of the group, the process was highly successful in bringing states closer together, in highlighting the complementarity of different initiatives and different processes and instruments, and also lending clarity to what needs to be done, what states need to work more on for processes that we will be having in the future, like the upcoming GD on further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, which is set to start this November. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the interventions by the other speakers, as well as the question and answer segment of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Almudena. I will point out in the comments section, my Secure World colleagues have very graciously put the link both to the Open-Ended Working Group homepage, so you can, curious about reading the history or learning about the chair, you can read more there. And then they also included a link directly to the chair summary that Almudena brought up. So you can read it straight from the original source there, in addition to Almudena's excellent summary. So with that, I'd like to go to one of the very strong and pervasive participants in the Open-Ended Working Group, Claudio. Claudio, can you give us some comments of your thoughts of how things went and where do you see things going from here?
Thank you very much, Victoria. Hope you hear me well. It is my pleasure to be here, and I appreciate Secure World Foundation for the invitation, especially for me to take part in this distinguished panel with experts that I greatly admire. I will just try to build on what Almudena has said about the breadth of the discussions that took place at the OEWG. I won't repeat it. I'll just focus on what the value, what the worth of that exercise was from my perspective as a representative of a state party. And of course, some ideas on how these discussions should be carried forward. To begin with, I agree with Almudena that the OEWG has been an extremely useful exercise, even though it was not able to agree to a final report. I believe that it was groundbreaking, especially in the sense that it was the first occasion in which all member states came together to discuss matters of space security in a results-oriented framework. One of the major takeaways that we have from the OEWG was that it served as a demonstration, a very powerful demonstration, that space security is not just an issue for major spacefaring nations. I think it represented a prise de conscience, an awakening of awareness about the fact that all states have a stake in maintaining space security, and also that developing states are particularly vulnerable. I'd like to recall an African proverb that I heard many years ago: when elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. And I think that this represents the reality here as well. So it's not by accident that we now have a renewed interest in this issue of space security in Paris, coming from all quarters. Many regions are engaged and participated actively in this discussion. And that was a learning opportunity as well, for not just for those that are beginning to get involved in this, but also even for spacefaring nations. We had a number of very productive discussions, especially about the relevance and the limitations of the current legal framework, and about how the existing legal principles can and should be further developed, and above all, about the current and emerging space threats in all its dimensions: Earth to space, space to Earth, and space to space. However, the OEWG could not translate its discussions into tangible recommendations due to the fact that consensus was blocked. This was very disappointing, and it mirrored the experience of the 2019 GG on Paris, which was chaired by Brazil, by Ambassador Guilherme Patriota, whose draft report met the same fate. We believe that both of these results demonstrated there is a profound deficit of trust between major actors in the space domain. And it also demonstrated that we are still trapped on a circular debate as to what aspects of Paris, of space security, should take precedence. One area where this dissent is particularly strong is the issue of whether there is an opposition between pursuit of non-binding norms and the objective of a legally binding instrument on Paris. On this issue, my country, Brazil, continues to be very attached to the objective of a legally binding instrument on Paris. Our support to the OEWG and its objective of developing voluntary norms of behavior of states in outer space derives from the understanding that this option represents a viable alternative that will serve as a basis for future negotiations of legally binding instrument on Paris. Another issue of contention is what sort of space threats should be addressed as a matter of precedence. Particularly prominent breach is the one between states that emphasize the need on prevention of placement of weapons in outer space, while others advocate for a focus on anti-satellite weapons, ASAT weapons. On this, there's not a lot that is new. We have been locked on this very stalemate for more than 40 years. I'd like to recall that in 1981, the first two UNGA resolutions on the issue of Paris that were adopted were already competing resolutions. Each was tabled by either side of the Cold War divide, and they already demonstrated this opposition. One resolution called for the prohibition of the placement of weapons in outer space, while the other resolution called for the prohibition of ASAT systems. And the same competing priorities are very much present today. How can we reconcile those priorities? I think that the first order of business is that we avoid repeating the same points that have been made in the past 45 years. We need new approaches and fresh thinking. And the second order of business is that we need a holistic approach, one that takes into account the security concerns of all states. We believe that initiatives that focus on specific issues, such as, for example, the proposal by Russia, 2014, on a non-binding moratorium on the non-first placements, and the more recent proposal by the US on a moratorium on direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, they are very helpful. They cannot aspire to be comprehensive answers to the challenges of outer space security, but they do contribute to creating a basis of understanding and an environment of trust. More importantly, we need to have a common understanding on how to tackle space security and Paris as a whole. Otherwise, we will not be able to break out of the circular debate about whose priorities should come first. To this end, we have to bear in mind that outer space security is not detached from security considerations in other domains. Outer space security is intrinsically connected not only to conventional warfighting on Earth, but also is a key element of nuclear deterrence strategies. We cannot consider these space issues on a vacuum, because, you know, if no space is in a vacuum, it is not in security framework terms. The upcoming GG on Paris, of which I am proud to be a member, has an extremely important role to play in this regard, and we hope that the failure of the past OEWG and of the last GG on Paris will not cast a shadow on it, but instead that their experience will highlight the need for concrete advances and for compromise, which has been very lacking in this domain. Notwithstanding the fact that the GG has this very important role to play, we need to continue open and inclusive discussions on space security. This has been widely recognized at the end of the last OEWG. But we are very concerned about how the discussions on this issue, on how to take this debate further, are going on at the UNGA First Committee, which is happening as we speak. And there we have two competing resolutions that aim at creating separate OEWGs, each with different mandates, different timeframes, and different expected end results. One proposed by the UK and another one proposed by Russia. Brazil and other countries, many other countries, have consistently called on both pen holders to try to bridge their differences and offer us, the UN membership, one clear path ahead, avoiding redundancies and conflicting mandates. This would pose serious problems for progress in this field. However, voting on the First Committee draft resolutions is bound to begin tomorrow, so the chances of our last-minute deal are very scant, to say the least. We continue to believe, Brazil, that there is no opposition between the normative approach and the legally binding approach, but unfortunately, there are quite a few countries who still fear that this normative, non-binding approach is a diversionary tactic. Given how discussions on this matter have unfolded in the past 45 years, these are not concerns that can be wished away or be called as unwarranted. So what we need, in our view, is for states to take a leap of faith, with states that have been resistant to the idea of discussions on an LBI on Paris, to take a leap of faith and to affirm their willingness to consider concrete steps towards that end. I think this would make a tremendous difference on how these discussions move forward, especially now that we have multiple avenues for these discussions to take place. I think it's going to be a particular challenge to to ensure that they occur in a mutually reinforcing and compatible way. But Brazil is ready to play that part to the best of our abilities. Thank you very much once again. Look forward to discussions here and to hearing Jessica's observations about our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia. Claudia, really appreciated that overview of how your country and your ministry approach these discussions. And we too hope that there will be some way to find complementarity and ways to work forward on this issue. So there are not competing processes, but mutually reinforcing processes. And with that, finally, I'd like to have a turnover to the mic to Jessica West, my fellow civil society observer. We spent quite a lot of time sitting next to each other, comparing notes during the open-ended working group, and I'd love to hear her perspective of how things went and where does she see the process going ahead in the future. Jessica.
Yeah, like Victoria, I was privileged to be able to be in the room. And my own takeaway from the discussions is that while we did not have good vibes only, I think that the quality of the discussion at the open-ended working group was unprecedented. We have never had an open discussion that allowed that kind of breadth of consideration for security threats in outer space before. We have never discussed all of the tools of space security governance in one forum. We've never had that level of inclusive discussion that included, I think the report mentions more than 70 states as well as non-state actors. And we've never seen the quality of cross-regional cooperation that emerged throughout the discussion. In fact, I think it's because it was so successful that we now have these parallel proposals for open-ended working groups that Claudio mentioned. And I think when you put the quality and the openness of this discussion together, what I see emerging from it is a real maturation of the debate on space security in ways that I don't think any process or forum has been able to achieve in the last 40 years. And I think the maturation is reflected in the fact that we're now aware that there is so much space between the stale dichotomies that Peter, Madana, and Claudio refer to. And it's this space between the poles that I think can help move us forward. So as Claudio mentioned, I think PEROS is no longer seen only as a debate between states with major military capabilities and then leaving those without on the sidelines. Clearly, this is an issue that involves everyone, and that the effects of that realization extend far beyond just the open-ended working group. I think it's the fact that we see a growing number of states joining the moratorium on destructive anti-satellite testing, countries like Canada and Costa Rica that have no capabilities for this, but understand that their voices matter on these issues. We now see that PEROS is not just a debate between weapons in space and anti-satellite weapons. States brought to the table a wide range of capabilities and activities that they perceive as threatening. This includes non-kinetic capabilities such as cyber interference, particularly with civilian services and command and control systems for strategic weapons. They raised intentional destruction of objects as threatening. They raise certain types of close approaches and other military exercises and activities as potentially threatening. And that really opens the door to how we talk about security in outer space. I think PEROS also showed that this perceived dichotomy between legal and normative or non-legal approaches is also, it's not a dichotomy. Discussions of norms at the open-ended working group were very clearly rooted in the existing legal framework, and the complementarity of those tools really came to the fore in the discussion. I think another thing that came out is this concept that behaviors and capabilities are two different ways of approaching peace and arms control in outer space, whereas, the discussion showed that like norms and law, these are really embedded and complementary with one another. Every time we were talking about behaviors in space, we were at the same time talking about capabilities. We were talking about how they're used. And it goes the other way as well. During dedicated discussion on possible placement of weapons in space, states tend to fall back on discussing this in terms of the effects and uses of different space systems. And so that dichotomy is eroded, I think, in my mind. I think we also think about peace and security in outer space more broadly. I think weapons and the prevention of weapons is core to PEROS. And yet we also had an opportunity to talk about environmental contamination, which can have indiscriminate impacts. We talked about humanitarian objectives and possible harms. We talked about other human considerations, including gender, which can lead to differentiated and disproportionate impacts when there are threats to space systems. And I think most importantly, we hopefully came to the realization that the answers or the path forward on PEROS is no longer a simple choice between a legal agreement and nothing. States raised a broad array of measures that can help to enhance peace in outer space, from having points of contacts and lines of communication to behaviors such as exercising due regard for others through prior notifications of activities and coordinating activities in advance. The use of cooperative mechanisms such as consultations and diplomatic channels to resolve security considerations. So I guess my main takeaway is that PEROS, after this discussion, should no longer be viewed as an either-or debate. PEROS is a this and that discussion. And I think we really need to use all of the tools that we have in our toolbox, as Victoria mentioned in the introduction. That said, the fact that there's no single answer to a single security challenge in outer space can also make moving forward as a community in a single direction difficult. So I agree with Claudio that we really have our work cut out with us going forward in terms of being able to bring these strands together and move forward as a single community in outer space holistically. I'll stop, but actually, I think we should also just give a round of applause to everybody who participated. I skipped that. I didn't want to talk too long, but I would like to thank all of the state participants, the hosts, as well as organizations such as UNIDIR and the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs, who worked very diligently in the background, because really it's all of that effort that made this successful. And now I'll stop.
Jessica, that was perfect timing. My computer just cut out, and you covered the gap very beautifully. So thank you. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and we only have a short time to go through them. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative, just get at maybe a quick point of clarification for perhaps people in the audience that aren't as familiar with the UN vocabulary as some of our panelists are. What exactly is the difference between a GGE and an OEWG? Who would like to clarify that really quickly and explain why one process is chosen over another?
I think Alma should do it because I heard her do a great job of this earlier this week.
All right, Alma, you're top.
Sure, I can do it. So an open-ended working group is, as the name itself says, it's open. So that means it's open to every single UN member state, but also to other stakeholders like representatives from industry, academia, civil society, who can go there and represent their own interests. They wouldn't be representing any state. And GG stands for Group of Governmental Experts. This is tends to be a more reduced group of up to 25 representatives, and they are representatives nominated by states. So even though the representatives themselves don't necessarily have to be diplomats, they often are. But they don't have to. They can also be professors, for example, or experts in other capacity, but they are nominated by states. And this is a closed group, so nobody outside of that group is allowed to enter the discussions, listen in, or participate or submit documents in the way that you can do in a OEWG. I don't think there is a better or worse way of doing things. Both groups have their advantages and their disadvantages. Something that states have really appreciated throughout this latest OEWG is that it's very inclusive. And this is becoming an increasingly important issue for many states as they become aware that even if they might not be spacefaring themselves, they do heavily rely on space services. So this has been a really important issue for global South states, for example. But the GD is also very good at efficiency. The Group of Governmental Experts is a group of experts, which is not always the case when it comes to the OEWG. The diplomats at the OEWG might not necessarily be experts on space security issues. So GD discussions tend to be more efficient. There is less need for clarifying concepts that people in the room already know. So sometimes it can be easier to reach an agreement or to reach a consensus and therefore to fulfill the mandate. And we saw this in the 2013 GD and in the 1993 GD. So again, both can be very good for some things, less good for others. And I think the ideal recipe in the end is the combination of both. So we will hopefully see this when this upcoming GD starts in November. We'll hopefully see that the experts for that GD take into account the work that the OEWG has already done. I hope that answers the question.
Did for me, thank you. And then just one more clarification, just for people to get a sense of the timeline. So this GG is meeting in November, and then when is it meeting again?
So then the next time that it will be meeting, it will be, I believe, the 1st and 2nd weeks of August of 2024.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left for this portion of our discussion. So we've got some great questions coming in from the audience. I encourage everyone to keep submitting them to the comment section, and I'll try and get my panelists involved in as many of these as possible. One question for consideration by Paul Meyer. We can continue to repeat that the political and legal approaches are not mutually exclusive, but the diplomatic reality is that the states will need to agree on one or the other if they are to produce an outcome accord. How can this difference of approach be bridged? Another way that I was thinking along the same lines, and Claudio brought up the idea there's a lack of trust. How do we build up a trust? Is that the way we bridge this difference of approach, or is there some other way of handling it? Who would like to take the first shot at that one?
Well,
Claudio?
Yeah. I can take a shot at it. I'm not sure if I'll be able to comprehensively answer the question. I think I already touched upon what my view about this issue is. I think that a lot of states have voted in favor of the resolution, the UK resolution that created the OEWG, which had a mandate to discuss non-binding norms, even though these states are very attached to the objective of a legally binding instrument on Paris. This is the case of Brazil. Brazil has always participated actively in the CD, in discussions on in the context of the CD on Paris. We have not abandoned this objective, quite the contrary, remains as important as ever, perhaps even more so, but we chose to believe that the resolution that created Paris, that created the OEWG, I'm sorry, which pointed to the fact that the discussions on norms would contribute to a discussion on future discussions on the LBI on Paris, would be that we decided to take that promise on its terms and to work constructively towards that end. I think that to a great extent is the reason why the OEWG was so successful, because states that believe in the objective of an LBI, many states decided that perhaps the best way to reach that objective is through a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach that had been the case for the past 45 years. In the CD, we've been trying to negotiate from scratch a legally binding instrument on Paris, and that hasn't proven to be effective to this point. So perhaps, but still, there's a lot of states that believe that this idea of discussing non-binding norms is a diversionary tactic. It's in a way to pull the discussions away from an LBI. So I think that one particularly effective way of bridging that gap would be, for example, for the GGE on Paris, which has a mandate to recommend possible elements of a legally binding instrument on Paris, to reach a successful conclusion, to adopt a consensus report. In my view, even for those states that are not convinced at this point in time of the feasibility of an LBI on Paris, to agree to a report, a substantive report on a Paris Treaty, would be a significant demonstration of willingness to engage. We hoped that this would have been the case in 2019 when we chaired the GGE on Paris, that ended without a result. That didn't happen at the time, but I think we have another opportunity here, and that opportunity, in my mind, should not be missed.
Thank you. Other thoughts from the panelists? Jessica?
Yeah, I think that lack of trust is really the core issue that Claudio raised, and it goes the other way as well, though. I think some states are very much concerned about not knowing and not trusting, what is a weapon in space and what is a commitment not to place one in space. And here I think there's a lot of value that can be leveraged from the open-ended working group discussion through a behavioral approach. So I saw in the questions, dual purpose is in there somewhere, but there's a lot of technology that is, general purpose in some ways. It can be used to do things that are incredibly helpful, such as servicing and removing debris from orbit, but those same capabilities could be used for harm. And I think a behavioral approach, if we could agree on some rules that states abide by when they're using them in a non-threatening way to show that it's non-threatening, prior notification and transparency measures that provide information about what you're doing, when and how, I think that could also help us towards having greater confidence when we have the discussions about what kind of capabilities we might not want to have in space and how we know if they're up there, how we differentiate between something that is intended to be used peacefully and something that might not be. And again, so I see these conversations as being very much embedded in one another.
Thank you. Next question is coming from Neil Wolf. Did the discussion of the OEWG proceed upon a definition of space security that is the same or very nearly the same as the definition of the term utilized by the former Space Security Index publication editorial team? Almudena, I feel like you might have some thoughts about maybe how a lexicon might be helpful in this case.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I'm laughing because UNGA and the Secure World Foundation just recently launched a space security lexicon, which was edited by Victoria and myself. So I'm always very happy to talk about this. So it is true that there is a lot of terminology in space security discussions where we found that even though the words employed are the same, the meanings behind those words are actually different. And we thought it was essential that to build that trust and that common understanding that Claudio and Jessica were just speaking about, it's really necessary to ensure that every single state that sits at that negotiating table understands what everybody else means. So with that in mind, we created this space security lexicon that I would urge you to check out. And it is an evolving project, so any thoughts that you have on it, please do not hesitate to share them with us, either with Secure World or with Unity. We would be more than happy to hear your thoughts. To answer your question on space security more specifically, there is no universal agreement on what space security means, but generally most states understand that space security is concerned with the relationship that exists among space objects and activities and the maintenance of international peace and security, disarmament, including this concept that comes up very often, the prevention of an arms race in outer space or Paris. So it's really concerned with intentional actions from humans instead of accidental activities that can cause harm. So it focuses more on threats rather than risks or hazards. Those risks and hazards, it's pretty much COPIOS in Vienna that deals with them. And space security discussions focus on issues like the weaponization of outer space and how to avoid it, how to avoid the intentional creation of space debris, or how to avoid states interfering intentionally with the daily operations of space assets and space activities, that concept of harmful interference. So again, there is no common understanding, no universal common understanding. There are many states in the global south, for example, who take an approach to space security that is a lot more focused on this idea of sustainability. Of course, you do need space security as well to reach that goal of space sustainability, but for many states that focus on ensuring the preservation of the space environment is a lot more important than the weaponization of outer space, for example, which tends to be the focus of the major space powers. But yeah, even though there is no universal common understanding or no universal definition, I feel that most states came to these negotiations at the OEWG with this sort of general understanding of what space security was or is.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panelists about common understandings or helping with this type of approach? Jessica.
Oh, well, I think it's also important to remember that the open-ended working group was not linked to space security per se. It was really linked to the UN mandate on prevention of an arms race in outer space, PAROS. So we are using the term space security, but the group itself is linked to that really fundamental mandate on PAROS. And I will say that, like the Space Security Index, thank you, Neil, for the pitch, the approach was comprehensive. So states talked about Earth to space threats, space to space threats, space to Earth threats, kinetic threats, non-kinetic threats, as well as transparency and confidence building measures. So the full gamut was there.
Great, thank you. Claudia, anything really quickly?
Yeah, just to chip in on this discussion, I think that I agree with both Almudena and Jessica. There's no clarity about what the term space security means. I think that it's used as a sort of a fallback term to express everything that is not safety or is not related to peaceful uses of outer space, which is the remit of COPIOS. But also that evidences the need for clarity in many other areas. So there's no definition about what a space weapon is, about dual use, a major concern, and one of the reasons why there's this upswell of support for a discussion on behavior, because in the classic focus on capabilities that has been the approach of many arms control measures thus far, does not fit perfectly in this realm where basically any object in space can be used as a weapon. There's not a lot of clarity about concepts such as what constitutes use of force in outer space. This only makes it absolutely evident that we need to continue this discussion. We have shed some light on this during the past OEWG, but there's still a lot of work to be done on space security, or PARIS, or however you may want to call it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And along those lines, I would like to also to promote a product that Secure World Foundation UNGA put out just a couple months ago called a Space Security Portal, with the idea of having an interactive map of the global space security governance landscape to click on various countries to see if they have space strategies, if they've signed on to various resolutions, if they've signed and ratified various treaties relevant to the discussion. And it's up on the screen right now, and the URL should be in the comments section, but it's a very easy to remember, spacesecurityportal.org. So with that, I think I have overstepped a little bit of the time. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel for a great discussion of the Open and Working Group, and looking forward to maybe convening everyone again in the future to see how they think the next step went. And hopefully we'll be able to continue to see some progress so that space can be secure, sustainable, and predictable for all over the long term. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Brian Whedon, who'll be shepherding our next process through. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As Victoria mentioned, my name is Brian Whedon. I'm the Director of Program Planning here at Secure World Foundation. And it's my pleasure to moderate the next section of today's program, which features some very interesting research that was done by Qingwei Sui, who is a graduate professional in the Space Security Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Before joining UNIDIR, Qingwei spent last summer as an intern at the Swiss Existential Risk Initiative in Geneva, where he worked with me on a research project in looking into why different countries voted the way they did on the recent UN General Assembly resolution on the anti-satellite testing moratorium that Peter mentioned in his introduction. In this current section, Qingwei is going to be giving a short presentation of the results of his research, which is being published today in a report on our website that I'll have more details on after his presentation. And that report was published with support from the Swiss Existential Risk Initiative. Following his presentation, Qingwei is going to have time to take a couple of questions from the audience that I'm going to moderate. So with that, Qingwei, I'll turn things over to you, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good day. And thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. So as Brian mentioned, I'm here to introduce my research into state positions on this very pertinent and salient topic. The excellent panel discussion before was extremely insightful and has set the scene up really well. And with that, let's dig a little deeper into this specifically. Next slide, please. So I'd like to stress that although I am a graduate professional with UNIDIR's Space Security Program at the moment, I'm here today strictly in my personal capacity, and that this research, as Brian mentioned, was conducted prior to my time at UNIDIR. So UNIDIR really has no involvement with what I'm presenting here today. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit of a background on the moratorium. You can see the slides on screen right now. And as you can see, it's very much linked to the OEWG process. And to date, there have been 36 pledges made by various states. Costa Rica was the latest one at the first committee. Norway has, quote, supported it as well. So it really could be 37 too. We're just waiting for confirmation there. But as you can see, the moratorium is specifically on destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing. So it's very specific wording. It was crafted to be that way for a purpose and for a reason. And we can see its implications later on in the presentation as to how that affects how countries feel about this. And as previously mentioned as well, There is another non-binding measure, that is Russia's no first placement of weapons in outer space. I do acknowledge it, and we won't be delving into that today as it's outside the scope of this research. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as for the resolution itself, we see, as Peter mentioned in his opening remarks, very substantial votes with 155 in favor, 9 against, and 9 abstentions. And the resolution's particularly short as well, with only 3 operational paragraphs, calling for states to commit not to conduct these tests, considering it as an urgent initial measure, and calling upon states to continue discussions to develop further steps that could contribute to an LBI on perils. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yep. So as to the research itself, this research provides insight into key questions, what prompted the moratorium and resolution, how states arrived at their positions, the key factors involved, and very crucially as well, it seeks to explain the gap between 155 states voting in favor of the resolution, with 37 states actually making the unilateral commitment. The full list, next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Oh, sorry, just I think internet cut out there for seconds before that, sorry. Thank you. Yes, so the methodology for this research, really quickly, I've gathered data through official state contributions at various UN fora, public statements made outside of these areas as well. And I conducted a series of interviews with high-level representatives from governments and independent state experts. So as you can see on the screen here, interviews were conducted with either high-level representatives or independent state experts on Canada, China, Philippines, Russia, and South Africa, along with a representative from a state in the non-aligned movement and 2 representatives from Western states as well. And Nigeria's representative chose to respond in writing. So this is a diverse list of how states voted. This is a diverse sample of states geographically and in how they voted for the resolution. I do want to acknowledge that states that abstain were unavailable to be interviewed in the time I had for this research, but their public statements were included in analysis as well. The full list of questions that I asked can be found in the report, and with all of this data, I conducted a thematic analysis to come to answers for the questions that we had set out to answer. Next slide, please. So really getting into the findings of this research, then we can see reasons for states to vote in favor can be grouped in these following categories. So these states are supportive of norms as a governing mechanism and or building block towards an LBI. They believe that even if this is non-legally binding, it is still effective as a space security measure. Next, states are supportive of this as what has been described as a capability neutral approach. So because the resolution and moratorium focuses only on the testing of destructive DA-ASAT missiles, it leaves open a possibility, for example, for the development of these capabilities as long as you do not test them. So it seeks to regulate the use of technology and not technology itself. And some states see that as a positive reason to support this because it doesn't constrain their technological development, for example. Next, states believe that this fits with what's considered a transparency and confidence building measure as set out in a report contained by the Group of Governmental Experts on TCBMs for outer space. And what's really important as well is that this resolution addresses and or acknowledges concerns from developing states and developing space powers, such as space debris, access to space, equitable access, and due regard to. Next slide, please. So we see these following reasons having been cited by states too. So there was really concerted effort in diplomacy by the United States to garner votes for this resolution. It is and was a US-led initiative, and they've been really active behind the scenes in drumming up support for that. And so this, and the next point ties into what I mentioned earlier. So these states are supportive despite the narrowness of the resolution. And They believe that it's still beneficial. They stress that it could serve as a stepping stone towards more comprehensive measures, more moratoriums in the future, potentially an LBI in the future. And crucially, they also believe that because it's very narrow, it makes it very verifiable. States would be able to see that other states are not conducting these very visible tests. And they see that as a strength to the resolution, it being crafted very narrowly in this way. And next, obviously, there's the influence of geopolitics as well. What's interesting to note here are states voting in favor in spite of the resolution's heavily politicized nature. So the non-aligned movement is a really interesting group of countries there, which I'll get into later in my presentation as well. And finally, states are also concerned by previous destructive DA-ASAT tests in the past. So numerous sources have cited that the latest test by Russia in 2021 really provided an impetus for the creation of this initiative. And so finally, states think and believe that this resolution does not affect or positively affects national security. Next, please. Yep. So as for the states who voted against, again, these are a very small group of states compared to the ones who voted yes. What I haven't listed here is one of the biggest ones, which is the opposition because of the narrowness of the resolution. They believe that it's ineffective for perils. Following that, these states often are extremely opposed to the idea of any space security measure that is not a legally binding instrument. They believe that it must and necessarily should be the first step. After that, there is what's been called as a sword and shield argument. So this is the argument that the resolution provides the United States, having already tested this technology, both an offensive sword and a deterring shield, while preventing other states from gaining the defensive benefits of developing this capability as well. And lastly, and this is something that the panel has touched on earlier too, is the idea that some states disagree with the framing of this resolution in terms of responsible and irresponsible behavior. They believe that this is a disagreeable rhetoric, and they are not a fan, and it does not it doesn't encourage them to be supportive of this resolution. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So again, there's the factor of geopolitics. What's interesting here are states abstaining because of the resolution's heavily politicized nature. States are also concerned and suspicious over past rhetoric. They distrust the reasons behind and merits of the resolution due to previous statements referring to space as a warfighting domain by states who are pushing for this resolution and moratorium. They are also concerned by previous destructive DA-ASAT missile testing, with the US having conducted this in the past. They viewed these states that vote against it hold the view that the resolution is therefore hypocritical and its merits suffer as a result. And then lastly, there's also the point that they do not believe that this improves national security, and that in fact it might actually worsen things for the states concerned. Next slide, please. So lastly, for the states who have abstained, again, it's a small group of states who have abstained, and similar reasons cited between them are the influence of geopolitics, where states are abstained because of the heavily politicized nature of this resolution. These states often also have a strong preference for an LBI. So what I said earlier about the states who voted no, they tend to have an extremely strong opposition. These states who abstained, I would characterize them as having a strong opposition to any measure that's not an LBI. So there's a bit of a distinction there. These states also cite the narrowness of the resolution as making it ineffective because it only focuses on, again, the testing of destructive DA-ASAT missiles. And finally, there's a point here, and this also touches on the earlier panel discussion about security and sustainability and safety and the gaps therein for space as a whole. So some states believe that this resolution's heavy focus on space debris puts it under the remit of UN COPRAS rather than anything by a space security body of the UN instead. Next slide, please. So coming to the end now then, just some sort of high-level takeaways and concluding remarks. So we see a significant concern by many states over destructive DA-ASAT missile testing, and also a heavy emphasis on the orbital debris that such tests would generate. So, and what's important and what's interesting here is the framing of this resolution as a positive step to reducing space debris, and how that was key in securing the support of developing states and developing space powers. That's my third bullet point here, about how developed space powers tend to have more traditional security concerns to do with these capabilities, how it impacts their national security, etc. Whereas for developing space powers who may have significantly less satellites or no satellites of their own at all, they're not really concerned as much about the national security implications. It's still a concern, but what's more important for them are issues such as space debris, access to space, and due regard under Article 9 of the OST. And we very much saw through the process of the negotiations before the resolution and in the text of the resolution itself, acknowledgement of these concerns that really helps get all of the countries on side. And this leads to my next point, which is that the support of some non-aligned movement states was very instrumental to the success that the resolution has been met by so far. So just to characterize the non-aligned movement for people who may be unaware, it's the NAM as a grouping of countries. They have a very strong geopolitical lens that they see everything through, and they have a traditional position of favoring legally binding instruments. An interviewee told me about how, in his personal opinion, most UN delegates have a limited appreciation of the issue of space security, which then means that they default to the traditional NAM position, of which I've mentioned earlier, strongly favoring legally binding instruments and strongly seeing everything through a very geopolitical lens, even if there are efforts to frame something as being apolitical. But what's important here is that once one NAM state supports a resolution, there is no longer a quote NAM position against it, if that makes sense, opening the door for more countries to then support it. Next slide, please. Yes, so what was also interesting to note are similar reasons cited both for supporting and for opposition. So these are the narrowness of the resolution, the influence of geopolitics, previous DA-ASAT missile tests, and as mentioned by the previous panel too, the norms and LBI debate. So countries have cited all of these reasons as all of these influences and factors as reasons to either support or deny, which then makes it interesting when you look into the reasons that are unique to either camp, which you can find in my report, which I've laid out more in more detail. So states who voted against the resolution cited extremely similar reasons between them. But what's also interesting to note here is that there appears to be a softening divide between the two approaches of norms versus LBIs, something non-legally binding versus a legally binding instrument. As we see, which I put up on the screen, there was a joint statement issued by states that voted against the resolution, which had some positive language in there, noting that the suggestion to undertake the political commitment, the moratorium, is a step in the right direction, even if it characterizes it as insufficient, and even if they voted against it. And in the end, there was some positive language there, which is interesting to note, absolutely. But also, like on this topic of a softening divide, many countries who have previously said they only supported LBIs also supported this resolution. Again, getting so many NAM countries to support it, whereas the traditional NAM position is for an LBI. And what's more, the US has also indicated that it is potentially open to LBIs, legally binding agreements down the road too. But what we have to note, obviously, and this will come to no surprise for everyone here in the audience, is the current geopolitical climate and the effects that has. So I've laid out the quote on screen that one of my interviewees told me. Basically, the idea that before the hot phase of the Ukraine crisis started, in his words, there were signs that we might have moved somewhere in the direction of agreeing to start from norms to eventually reach an LBI. But for now, the overall competition makes it very hard to reach consensus. But I do not wish to end on this dour note, so next slide, please. Yep, so on to the very pertinent question of the gap between support for the resolution and the voluntary commitments that have been made. This was a point that an interviewee very much stressed to me, even if they were speaking in their personal capacity, which is the developing states' need for greater technical and legal expertise regarding the effects of these tests on how that would affect them as a state, but also domestically, what are their implications if they make the commitment. So there's a difficulty for these countries to comprehensively understand both technical and legal implications, which then makes it hard for the delegates to convince capital to make a decision and for capital to then decide what to do as well. This interviewee very much also stressed the disparity between technological and developmental levels between developing and developed states and space powers. And so it was important to this interviewee that this initiative was stressed to not be limiting them in terms of their technological development, for example. It shouldn't really hinder their use of space towards those ends. And just lastly, I'd like to end on the note that what we are possibly observing the emergence of a new norm against DA-ASAT missile tests. So it'll be very interesting to see how this continues to develop, whether more countries will support the resolution and make the moratorium. There appears to be momentum behind this, and that's why it was a very pertinent time to dig into this through my research. Last slide, please. So again, thank you so much for having me. I do want to, again, thank the Secure World Foundation for the opportunity for me to present this research. I'd also like to thank Cherry for funding this research and you, Brian, for your excellent mentorship as well. I would like to also say that if the audience is interested in a selection of relevant statements made by particular states or a group of states, I encourage them to look into the report because it's all laid out in a very neat table. So it'll be very easy to find information there. And you can find my details on the screen, so please do not hesitate to reach out to for anybody interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. And again, I need to thank you for the excellent work you put into. I'm not sure everyone in the audience appreciates how difficult it can be to get governments to comment on these things and provide insight into why they made some decisions or not. And Qingwei did a lot of good work trying to reach out and some build connections and go through not only the written statements that countries made, but also try and talk to some of the diplomats that were involved to better understand things. We've got a couple of, and I'm gonna, we get done here, I'm gonna give her a link to the report and a couple of things at the end of our discussions today. I've got a couple of questions to get to, but one for my own for you. Was there anything in your results or findings that was surprising to you based on sort of the preconceived ideas you had going into the research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think something that really stood out to me was the necessity of understanding the perspective of developing states. We do talk about this in the work that we do, how it's important to get their views on the table. But I think this is just a very concrete, practical example of how, if you put in the work, you can really reap dividends then. So interviewees did express to me how during the lead up to tabling the resolution and when there was this idea of the moratorium, a lot of work was spent by interested parties pushing for this to happen, to really have workshops and seminars to really teach or to help inform developing states why this is something they should be concerned about, how this actually affects their national security and their peaceful uses of space. And so definitely that was something that stood out to me as a concrete example of what should be the practice heading forward. And something else as well is just the interplay between different groupings of countries in the UN. So again, like all the information about how the non-aligned movement, how the NAM countries think about things and sort of the politics there. Obviously, for the experienced delegates in the room, they have understanding of all of these things. As someone who is not a diplomat, that was a particularly insightful piece of research for me too. And just very quickly, also just the softening force dichotomy between norms and LBIs as well.
Yeah, the geopolitics and how the regional groupings and how those things play out in the UN, I think some people might be surprised to see just how big of an influence that can have. And sometimes it's not about the substance, right? It's about those regional dynamics and the geopolitics. So to me, that gets to one of the questions in the audience. This is one from Tom Royer asked about what's the rationale behind doing a binding instrument first. And my own impression is that is due to a few factors. One is a lot of the participant discussions are lawyers, and lawyers like to have, write new laws and write new treaties. Also, I think it's partly because this topic historically has had a legal treaty first perspective coming out of the Conference on Disarmament, which is all about creating legally binding treaties. And the third, and I'd like your perspective on this, Qingwei, is I sense that a lot of the countries, particularly the non-aligned countries and the ones that are not space powers, want a legally binding perspective because they see it as the only way to get the big powers to abide by something, and the only way to kind of get them to really kind of commit. Is that the sense you get, or do you have another perspective on why there's such a focus on legally binding?
Yeah, absolutely. I echo all of your points there. There's definitely a historical element there too. And like you said, it's a way to really get bigger powers and bigger states to agree on a set of something that is binding to them, a document that would help to build a common ground or common sort of way moving forward. What I do want to say, though, was that this was right because, so in the context of answering this question, because there's always been this legally binding versus non-legally binding debate, some would call it a stalemate, states have found this to be a particularly refreshing approach almost. So one of the reasons that this initiative or this resolution was tabled is sort of like, hey, the traditional approach hasn't been working for a good while. How about we try something new with this very small, very specific part of the broader space security Paros picture to see how that's going to go if we just run with this. And this is the result that we're seeing happen before us.
There's another question here from Matt Mothorpe, who asks, why did Russia and China both vote against the resolution? They give specific reasons. I think you covered that more generally, but anything you want to add about why they specifically said they voted against it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the big reasons they did vote against this was just again to do with the geopolitical nature of this issue. So the US and other states that supported this really made an effort to depoliticize this initiative, but it is still seen through a very geopolitical lens at the end of the day. Something else as well is that because Russia and China were the most recent countries to have tested these types of weapons, well, actually, I think it was India before or after China. You can correct me on this, Brian. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that there's a certain sort of pride or honor. Well, no, that's not the right word. It's sort of like,
face.
Hey, we've tested this in the past. Exactly, face. That's it. Thank you. So there's that element too, for sure.
Yeah. No, I agree. And yes, Russia was the most recent one to test one of these weapons in 2021. And then before that was India in 2019. And I suspect that played a role in why India abstained on this. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, China tested one against a satellite in 2007. I'll just add to kind of put a more finer point on this geopolitics. In 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, we saw this happen in another part of the United Nations under the UN Committee on the Peace, Places of Outer Space, which at the time was dealing with the long-term sustainability of space. After Russia's invasion there and the resulting sanctions from the United States and NATO, Russia took a very adversarial approach to that entire process and tried multiple times to disrupt it. And I think one of the reasons for the strong Russian opposition to this is because of some similar, again, geopolitics with the renewed invasion early in 2022 of Ukraine, and Russia's desire to kind of fight back against the U.S. and European sort of pressure on them. So I think that's also a huge role in this. I want to finish up here with one more question here from Dr. Cassandra Steer. And was there any understanding among the interviewees about the unlawfulness of the use of an ASAT? Did anybody mention that? Was there any discussion of that you saw in your research?
And how this might make it easy to make a commitment to not test in times of peace? Yeah, that's an excellent question. So for my interviewees who come from more of a So for my interviewees who are experienced in law, this was definitely a big factor there. So it's, and the legal experts in this room know this a lot better than I am, but the debates about this are ongoing at the moment. Some states did mention that in the interviews. What's also important to note here is just repeating the point I made earlier about how for many states, they do not understand, well, for developing countries, they might not necessarily understand the implications of making this commitment legally on them, what that actually entails. And that's the reason why more work has to be done in that area there. But I would say that for the most part, law was mentioned, but there wasn't a huge emphasis based on what I found in the research that I've done for this personally. I think in my sense is that a big reason why that wasn't more of a topic, more of a substantive matter, is because this is a non-binding resolution, and that it has only 3 operational paragraphs. So because of that, it makes it very easy for states to support it, and the legal question might not have been emphasized as much as a result. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, and I would just add, I'm not aware of any country that has said testing or use of a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon is illegal or breaches some aspect of the Outer Space Treaty or other part of international law. So it may have, but at least I don't recall ever seeing that. So this is an area where so far no one has said it's illegal in its nature. Well, thank you very much, Jingwei, for this. I'm going to talk about a report in a second when I get to the last part of our discussion here. But excellent research, and I think it's the start of a great career in this topic. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
So now I want to turn to the last part of our program here as we're wrapping up, and want to walk through several different publications that Secure World is releasing today that are related to this topic that we've been talking about. The first one is a new Secure World Foundation fact sheet on the open-ended working group on reducing space threats, which we talked about in the first segment. The fact sheet discusses the origin of the OEWG, summary of the major points of discussion, and links to a whole lot of references, including the excellent detailed summaries published by Jessica West, and the underlying implementing UN documents, which for those of you who's tried to search through the UN website to find a document can be very difficult to find. So we've gone ahead and linked those in there. And as you can see, you can find this on our website, and we're going to put links to all of these both in the chat in a second, as well as we're going to have a summary page from this event on our website that'll again have a summary sort of collection of these different links. The second product we're announcing today is Jingwei's full report, which is going to be listed on our website under the sponsored research category. And again, in his report are all the details of his research, the tables summarizing the points made by the different groups of countries and why they decided to support something, support the testing resolution or not, kind of broken down by different groups. So that is also available for download on our website. And again, we thank the Swiss Existential Risk Initiative for their support of both his research and in putting the report together. The third product we are releasing today is a web page that is dedicated to multilateral space security initiatives. As we've talked about, what's going on with the ASAT test moratorium is not the first time we've talked about this, neither is the open-ended working group. So we wanted to put together a page that kind of provided some of the background and some of the history on these things. So as you can see in the background, it talks about the work that's been ongoing in the Conference on Disarmament for the last few decades on Paros. It mentions the 2007 International Code of Conduct that was proposed by the European Union, the 2011 Group of Governmental Experts on transparency and confidence building measures, and then the most recent open-ended working group that we talked about. It then also summarizes 2 ongoing sets initiatives to have voluntary pledges related to space security. The first is the No First Place in Weapons in Outer Space pledge, or NFP, that was first proposed by the Russian Federation in 2004. And then the second one is the voluntary moratorium on destructive anti-satellite testing that was first proposed by the United States back in 2000, or sorry, just recently in 2022. And it talks about sort of the origins of both of those initiatives. And then it links to the fourth product, which is a public Google tracking sheet, where we have a record of all of the related UNGA resolutions, where you can see, all the resolutions that have put forward, how each country has voted on the various resolutions. If we can go to the NFP tab, yep. And then also has a link to the countries that have made either the NFP pledge and or the anti-satellite testing moratorium pledge. And I'll note, for the record, there are currently 37 countries that have made the direct ascent ASAT test moratorium pledge, with Costa Rica, one of those non-aligned countries that we talked about in Ching-Wei's research, and Norway being the two that have most recently discussed that. So in this spreadsheet, which is publicly available, you can see all the countries, you can see how they voted on the resolutions, and then there's links to their official announcements of a pledge either way. So all these are available on our website, and we'll send out a short summary after the meeting. With that, I'd like to wrap up today's event. Thank you all for participating. Really enjoyed seeing some of the back and forth and some of the discussion going on in the chat. There will be a recording of this on our YouTube channel afterwards. We will also be making the presentation that was given by Ching-Wei available on our website, again, along with the other products that were just mentioned. So thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.